It is true that economics is everywhere. You see, put a little graphic up here. It says, since when did economists become sociologists? And the joke that I made when seeing this particular cartoon was that, well, in a way, economists always were sociologists, but they're just sociologists with better empirical methods. They were a little bit more rigorous with the math, more interested in analyzing big data sets, et cetera. But at the end of the day, economics is really about understanding human behavior in a number of forms, whether either directly relating to money or indirectly relating to money, because really that's a lot of what our daily lives are all about. So I wanted to just give you an overview of a number of different examples about how you find economic principles and economic concepts just going around in daily life. For example, you might have gone to a store. I think Dunkin' Donuts does this a lot. And the store will say, if you don't receive a receipt for the correct amount of your purchase, please tell the manager, or we'll give you an incentive. We'll give you a monetary incentive if you didn't receive a receipt. And most people probably just look at that and say, oh, that's nice. Oh, I got a receipt. That's not relevant. Myself, being an economist, can't help but sit there and think, well, why are they doing this? What exactly is the purpose of offering this reward? Why does the company really care whether or not I get a receipt for the correct amount of my purchase? Is it a legal thing? Is it an incentives thing? What do we really have going on? And once you sit down and think about the different incentives involved for the manager, for the worker, et cetera, you think about the following scenario. If I were a worker at one of these restaurants, I might say, oh, look, my customer just paid me in cash. I now have two options. I could either put the cash in the cash drawer like I'm supposed to, ring in the sale, and be legit about the whole thing. Or I could say, this person just gave me cash. I'm going to put the cash in my pocket and hope nobody figures it out. And the whole idea of the receipt is that you can't pocket the cash and give a receipt just because of the way the cash register works. So when you see something like this, what the manager is actually doing is giving the customer an incentive to make sure that the employees are doing what they're supposed to at their job rather than pocketing the money and not ringing up the sale. One of the challenges with management is if you're trying to motivate your employees, if you're trying to get your employees to do the right thing, one way to do so is via monitoring. Unfortunately, monitoring is usually very expensive because you have people just physically watching employees to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. Not necessarily the best way to go about things. This is actually a clever way to get around that because you're then providing that incentive for each customer that comes in the store to do so instead. So, oh, well, that's pretty interesting. So now when you see this in the store, you understand what your role as a customer, in fact, is. My general advice to you in life is to never go to a restaurant with an economist. Because if you've been, you go to a restaurant with a bunch of people, the bill comes at the end, and you have a number of choices as to how to split that bill. Now, each one of those choices carries with it certain incentives. One option, obviously, is to look at the bill, and everybody pays for what it is that they ordered. So well, that's fine. That actually gives the proper incentives. No one's going to overorder, underorder, et cetera, because they're paying for exactly what they consume. But it can be a little bit cumbersome, if you have the long receipt and everybody's adding up, oh, well, I owe $12.18, et cetera. So we can think about alternate methods of payment, but unfortunately, all of those other systems carry with them incentives for what I would consider in some ways bad behavior. Because say, for example, you were at dinner with a bunch of people, and you knew that the bill was going to be split evenly among all the people at the table. When you're making that decision as to whether to order the extra appetizer, the extra cocktail, whatever, what you'll realize is that, say you're with a total of 5 people at the table, you order that extra cocktail, you're only ending up paying for 20% of that cocktail. So, well, hey, that's a pretty good deal. I order a cocktail, I add $10 to the total bill. I only end up paying $2 of that out of my pocket. It then stands to reason that I would order more food, more cocktails, whatever it may be, than I would if I was actually having to pay specifically for everything that I ordered. So if people know ahead of time, oh, we're probably going to end up just splitting the bill, there's actually an incentive to overconsume to some degree. You could also think of some other creative ways of paying the bill. I have some friends that will play what they call credit card roulette, in that everybody takes a credit card, puts it in a pile, and then they'll fan out the credit cards and have the waitress pick one. And whoever's credit card gets picked, they have to pay the bill. Now, over the long term, this should be roughly the same as the everyone splits the bill concept, right? So it's just a little bit more risky because there's a difference between in expectation, you're going to pay 1 out of 5 times. What happens if you're that unlucky person whose credit card keeps getting pulled every time? You're probably going to be pretty unhappy. But you can think about, in that case, it's the same idea. There's only a certain percentage that you're going to actually end up having to pay for what you ordered. There's the same incentive for overconsumption. And there are a lot of different areas in which these misalignment of incentives, where you don't have to pay the cost of your actions, results in inefficient behavior, restaurants just being one of them. You can think of an extreme example of this being this concept of externalities. For example, with pollution, you get to conduct your business as a polluting factory, for example, and you don't have to pay the cost of what it is that you do. And that inefficiency results because you aren't actually internalizing the cost of your actions. This is a very similar situation in which, in a lot of cases where you're splitting the bill, you're not internalizing the full cost of your actions. So we have this idea of substitutes and complements that we learn at the beginning of Economics 101 all the time. So substitutes are things that are consumed one instead of each other, Coke versus Pepsi. And we say complements are things where we're consuming them together. In a more formal sense, complements are items where, as the price of one of the items goes up, the demand for the other one of the items goes down. So you can think DVDs and DVD players, things like that. If DVDs were to get really expensive, the demand for DVD players would go down because, well, why would you want a DVD player if you're not going to end up purchasing any DVDs because they cost $100 each? And there are a lot of companies that will actually use this concept of complements in their business model. And complements in a business sense are usually better known as loss leaders in an extreme form. Because this idea of the loss leader, selling one product at a loss to encourage people to purchase other products that are actually profitable for the company, is that same concept of complements and demands. That if you're vastly lowering the price of one item in order to stimulate demand for the other, if that cross-price elasticity is strong enough, you end up making a profit by taking a loss on one of your products. A very common example of this, as you can see in this cartoon here, is with car rentals. For example, last month I went to Denver for a conference, and I was shocked that it was actually cheaper to rent a car for 3 days than it was to take a cab from the airport. It just seemed very nonsensical to me. But nonetheless, I was standing in the line at the cab stand, looking up prices of rental cars on my phone, and saying, standing in this line is probably really not worth it. Let's go to the rental car place. As soon as we got to the rental car place, I understood why the rental car itself was so cheap. Because I had to sit there and get the litany of questions from the salesperson. Do I want the extended insurance? Do I want to prepay the gas? Do I want the GPS? Do I, all of these different things. And it becomes very clear that those add-ons, which people don't think about when they're deciding to rent a car, are really where the company is, in fact, making their money. And it all comes back to this economic notion of complements. So you can see, more so in the real world where these things actually occur, where they can be found, and how they can be used in a business strategy. I just put this one in because it was funny. So you can't really see, it's a little bit out of focus, but we have a graph up here. This is on a bottle of iced tea. The text says, it doesn't take an econ PhD to brew tea, but Barry has one, and sometimes it actually helps. This company was actually started by a professor at Yale. And the graph here talks about taste versus sugar. And the point that he's trying to make is that there's what we would call, in economics terms, diminishing marginal utility of sugar. So the first teaspoon increases the taste. It's helpful. And his point is that most companies go far beyond this utility maximizing point of sugar, and his company's value proposition is that it doesn't go that far and actually has a product that is, in his mind, more palatable. And I just thought that this was an interesting example of taking this economic concept of marginal utility and applying it to an area that it wouldn't normally be applied to. So it turns out that people really, really, really like free stuff. Not entirely shocking, but people like free stuff to almost completely irrational degree. So what I have here, this is a picture of the Ben & Jerry's in Harvard Square on Free Cone Day. And the line actually doesn't look that long because I can only get so much of it in the picture at once. But I went in, and there are about, I don't know, 60 or 70 people in line waiting for their free cone. And I just find this so interesting because these are people that, for the most part, wouldn't buy an ice cream cone if it wasn't free. So they're valuing this ice cream at something less than, however much it costs, $3, $4, et cetera. Because if they valued the ice cream at more than a price of $3 or $4 or whatever the ice cream cone costs, they would buy it even if it wasn't free, right? But given that these people, in large part, aren't normally consuming ice cream, but they're here on Free Cone Day, they're not properly valuing, in all likelihood, their time. Because when we're talking about opportunity cost, we say that opportunity cost is what you have to give up to get something. And that the true cost of any item is what you have to give up. And in this case, these people aren't giving up any money to get the free ice cream cone, but they are, in fact, giving up their time. And by waiting an hour to get a free ice cream cone, you've given up whatever the value of an hour of your time is, just in economic terms. So these people are effectively saying, well, the value of my time is worth, say they're waiting in line for an hour, they're saying that the value of their time is worth $3 or $4. Whereas if you ask them, oh, hey, will you go do this job that's roughly as boring as standing in a line for an hour, and I'll pay you $3 or $4, they probably wouldn't do it. But it all comes back to this idea of free just having an irrational hold on people. Dan Ariely is a professor at Duke University, and he wrote a book called Predictably Irrational that outlines a lot of the experiments that he's done looking at, from a behavioral perspective, how people perceive choices that involve money. And one of the things that he did find experimentally, in a more rigorous sense than I did with my lovely Free Cone Day pictures, is that even compared to a price of 1 penny, which for most people is entirely negligible, this idea of free just has a compelling hold on people, and sort of really gets your attention. in a way that's not necessarily efficient, not exactly the smart choice to make. Because even if you're choosing the free item, it may not be free in a non-monetary sense, but it also might not actually be the right choice for you, even if it looks good, because you're like, hey, free. The example that Professor Ariely uses is one of gym socks. I don't know why gym socks. It's very random. And his point was, say you're offered a choice between free, very basic gym socks versus nicer gym socks that you actually have to pay for. Rationally speaking, you would do a cost-benefit analysis to say, are the benefits of the nicer gym socks worth the price? But people tend to think, well, if this is free, I'm not actually giving up anything to get it, so it doesn't matter. Whereas in reality, consumption of the free item is in a way precluding consumption of the non-free item, which may have actually been a better choice for you as a consumer. So it's something I encourage you in your daily lives. As soon as you see something that's free and you feel like you're drawn to it, to just step back for a second and say, well, wait a minute. Is this something that's actually worth it? Or is it one of these too good to be true type situations? Like, what am I actually giving up in this scenario? Yeah, I'm guessing the person on the right must be an economist. Because think about what's going on here. You have someone saying, oh, I found, or I lost my iPod. Well, if you find it, I'll give you a $50 reward. There's no way for this person to actually prove that it was theirs. You know, I could put these signs up everywhere if I wanted somebody basically to sell me an iPod for 50 bucks. So hey, why not start the bidding process and say, oh, well, clearly, if this first person here was the real loser of the iPod, well, can't I just outbid them to get it back? Now, you end up with a little bit of a behavioral question here, in that, which guy is the real one? Because the assumption here is that the first guy is the real one, and then the second guy here is just trying to outbid him. So I just wanted to give you a short little lesson. One of my particular areas of research is in education, and specifically the causal impact of effort on student outcomes. So basically answering the question of, is doing your homework going to make you a better student? And this is typically a difficult question to answer, because I look at extra credit tests that students take in the course that I teach, and I look at their final grades. Now, not surprisingly, there's a positive relationship between extra credit and grade. And you say, OK, that makes sense. The students that do more extra credit get a better grade, not including the extra credit, because that would be stupid. But it's unclear whether students are doing better because they're taking these extra credit tests and getting the tutoring help that comes along with it, or it just happens to be that the better students are more motivated and they're going to do the extra credit because that's just what they do. And we put a lot of resources into this program. We pay a lot of students to grade the tests, to provide the tutoring help, et cetera. And it would be nice to say whether or not these tests actually have an impact on student outcomes. So in a creative way to get around this selection problem, I noticed that students who lived closer to campus, just because it was easier for them to go take the tests, were more likely to go and do their extra credit. And students who lived further away were less likely. Now, in this particular environment, students were randomized as to where they lived. So it's not like the better students chose to live nearby and the worse students chose to live further away, or vice versa. You had random assignment into houses, but you had random assignment such that you were not only randomized geographically, but indirectly you were randomized into how much extra credit you did. And what I found was that students who were randomized into the closer houses, in fact, did do more extra credit. But students that were randomized into closer to campus houses also did better in the course. You say, well, that's an interesting finding, because if the students are randomized among houses, you would expect, on average, each house to have the same performance in the class. But that's not what happened. You say, well, given that we also see that those students are doing more extra credit, that actually provides a lot of support for, hey, paying attention and doing what in a way you're supposed to do actually is helpful. And you can think of a number of other potential explanations for this. Maybe the students that were closer to campus also went to class more. Maybe that it was easier for them to go to study groups and whatnot. But I noticed that the class was offered in the afternoon. So it was unlikely that, if it were a 9 a.m. class, I would say, oh, maybe they're choosing to not go to campus for their first class. Maybe there actually is a difference in class attendance rates. But in the afternoon, that seems to be less of a likely explanation. So we can actually see from the data that really engaging in the material, talking to people about the material, because that's essentially what the extra credit program was. You'd sit down, take a test, and then get real-time feedback from an upper class grader, that actually does have a substantial impact on a student's grade, all else being equal. So I certainly encourage you guys, as much as you can, as much as you have time for, to really make sure that you engage in the material and understand that that does, in fact, have an impact on your outcomes, and it's not a waste of time. The other lesson I want to give you, just because as an instructor it's really, really annoying, is to always label your axes. Just makes every graph you draw more understandable, more useful. And I'll point out here that maybe we'd have more incentive to do so if labeling our axes had an impact on our social life and not only our educational life. But thank you very much for having me.